Li and Xi when it comes to their thinking about innovation. And Dr. Greitens, as you've talked about sort of the use of internal security tools to promote control. And I think there's no doubt that control in the interests of protecting the party is the ultimate objective. But I'm really curious about, are there differences in approaches to decision making in the political, security, and economic sectors? Is this just Xi making all the decisions all the time in every sector and through every small leading group, or are we seeing differences? And I'm particularly interested in the context that Commissioner Camphausen and I often debate the role that the PLA may or may not play when it comes to final decisions about asserting Chinese interests in Taiwan. So I'm curious about, I guess the question is, can you clarify in each of the sectors that I see your expertise in, how decisions get made? Who makes them and what's the process? Dr. Greitens, can we start with you?
Sure. I would say that in national security, this is an area where Xi Jinping has taken a really central leadership role and has sought to put a personal stamp on both the concept and the implementation of national security, which in this case largely means internal security policy. I'm not an expert on economic policy, so I struggle to directly make comparisons about the decision-making processes. But I will say that one of the features of the anti-corruption campaign has been to remove a large number of senior level leaders in both the military and then the political, legal, or domestic security apparatus. And what we now see in the anti-corruption campaign, particularly the rectification and education campaign that is launching this year, is that there's an effort to really push consolidation of control and of responsiveness to the leadership team that Xi Jinping himself has put in place in the domestic security apparatus, right? The rectification and education campaign, I believe, and my research has focused a little bit on this, is directed at pushing his authority down through the lower levels of the system, not because the idea is that there might be some sort of regional mutiny or among coercive forces or something, but simply that there would be sort of shirking or non-responsiveness to the directives of the upper level leaders and the team that Xi Jinping has. That said, there are a few remaining mysteries. I don't want to take more time, but I'm happy to follow up with you offline to talk about some of the decision-making questions that I have. But that's how I would characterize national security. Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Ong, can you talk about the economic decision-making process?
Sure. Thank you very much. That's a great question. Let me make a couple of observations. The first point that I would make is that the example that I gave of the differences in opinion between the President Xi and the Premier Li is just one example of other possible divisions and disagreements within the party. So this is not just limited to the number one and number two leaders. The second thing I would point out is that the differences in opinion between the first and second leader is not actually only in the realm of innovation. As I gave earlier on, even though the remark about China being a developing country seems really harmless, the fact that the premier really made an effort to push this message and announced it almost by surprise at a press conference is actually very revealing. And so the differences are not only about innovation, it's also about foreign policy. Should China be aggressive, or should it continue the path of keeping a low profile and be realistic? Should China be market oriented, or should it have a status approach? So the differences are actually not just in one realm, but across many. The third point I would make is that I think it is common knowledge by now that Xi has very effectively centralized power in his own hands. So all decisions, whether it's economic or political, really has his very, very strong imprint. And generally, we can see his preference and how it's different from past leaders. In foreign policy, he's much more assertive. He clearly prefers a status approach in economic management. And he's much more controlling in the political realm as well. Nevertheless, as someone who studies policy communication, one of the benefits that we can get out of this approach is that when we look at the communication that comes out of the party, even though we don't know the process and the black box that goes into that decision-making process, we can get some concrete signals of whether other kind of opinions manage to make their way into the final message. And so if you look at the way the CCP talks about its strategic position, its confidence, that is where you can see 95% reflects this kind of Xi rhetoric about China being an absolutely victorious, having this once in a century seismic shift, historical forces on its side. These are the kind of narratives that Xi prefers. But the last 10% would be dedicated to saying, but China is still a developing country and we are way behind the US. And you actually now see this template being repeated in other party documents, including a recent one by the Central Discipline Commission, which is a very powerful agency. So this is one way in which you can see that despite Xi being absolutely dominant in the process, other voices are still trying and struggling to make their way into the decision-making process to moderate his personal preferences. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Dr. Favell?
Yes, thanks very much. So turning to sort of foreign policy and national defense, I'd make 3 points. First, decision-making in these two sort of policy systems have always been sort of concentrated in the authority of the General Secretary of the party. So if one looks at the 7 members of the Politburo Standing Commission, only Xi Jinping has foreign policy and defense in his portfolio. If we look at the membership of the Central Military Commission more broadly, now today, Xi Jinping is the only non-uniform member of that commission. Within the broader Politburo itself, there is Yang Jiechi, who does sort of oversee the Central Foreign Affairs Commission and aids Xi Jinping in foreign policy. But nevertheless, both of these, I think, are quite centralized with Xi at the top. Now, the second question is, are they too centralized, right? And does this mean that discrepant information, competing views are not necessarily filtered up to the top of the decision, and thus poor decisions are in fact made? And that's, I think, a very important question to consider, although analytically very, very difficult to study. And then thirdly, with regards to the PLA in particular in Taiwan, I don't want to wade directly into your debate with Commissioner Camphausen, but I'll make the following observation, which is that I think because of the way in which Xi has worked so hard to gain control of the PLA, the way in which that discipline was elevated very prominently on the Central Military Commission in 2015, that major decisions that the PLA takes are taken with the approval of the General Secretary of the party, right? That there's not a lot of, especially at the strategic level, there's really no room for kind of policy entrepreneurship. That doesn't mean that necessarily everyone in the rank and file is happy with all the decisions that are made, but my own judgment would be that certainly when it comes down to questions of using force, that ultimately is a question for the Standing Committee and Xi in particular.
I think I win, Roy.
I was going to say I thought I'd won. Okay, let's turn to Commissioner Wessel.
Hi, thank you all for great testimony, both oral and written. Let me start with a quick vignette, I guess, on us. You know, we've been in operation 20 years. When we first started hiring many years ago, Chinese language skilled employees were very difficult to find. We are now, happy that we have broad interest in both serving on the commission, but very qualified staff. Certainly our current cadre is part of that. I think you all saw the House Intelligence Committee's report last year, which in part said the Intelligence community should formalize and broaden programs designed to mentor the next generation of China analysts. And you have all indicated that reading what China says, Chinese leaders say is vital, and we all agree, and as a commission, we've recommended that. If you can, beyond what you've already had in your testimony, provide us, for the record, your thoughts of any specific actions that we can take without going into it here to both work with Congress and the new administration to make sure that we do provide that cadre, that those who will fill your shoes many years from now, that would be very helpful to us. That's my first comment. Second, Dr. Ong, you talk about developing country status. And when I hear that term, I think of it in a different context, which is the legal status of China as it relates to trade law, as it relates to climate change, and a number of other, bilateral and multilateral regimes. And that China, when I hear them say that, I think they are trying to lower expectations or get the cover of a different legal regime that governs their path forward. Can you comment on that, since you've talked about it in a different context?
Sure. Thank you for your question. You are absolutely right to raise the point about developing country and that phrase having a certain connotation when said to a foreign or American audience. And you're absolutely right about that. What I wanted to point out is that in the Chinese context, who says something to whom makes a huge difference, even when they use exactly the same phrase and say exactly the same content. So I completely agree with you that when China throws out the term developing country in the context of WTO and to foreigners, that is often in the context of wanting to downplay its rise and plead leniency in fulfilling its obligations as a middle-income economy. What I wanted to point out is that, however, when Chinese leaders say that China is a developing country to its own people, this is a completely different context, in particular when President Xi says it himself, because this is inconsistent with the narratives that he has very much preferred about national rejuvenation and China's greatness and so on. So when I see that, I was quite surprised, and I would read that as some form of a compromise, or at least acknowledgement on his part that they need to downplay that over ambition. So this is something noteworthy, I believe, to US policymakers.
I appreciate that. So you don't view it as trying to, if you will, harmonize the inward and the outward messaging, but rather the different audiences.
Absolutely, different audiences. The Chinese are very conscious of when they're speaking to foreigners versus speaking to domestic audiences.
Okay. Dr. Greitens, if you could, you talk briefly about, the alignment or the intertwined internal and external challenges. And with recent commentary both by the Trump and Biden administrations regarding the Uyghurs and genocide, how do you view the use of that term and the heightened attention on the Uyghur issue in terms of those intertwined challenges?
I think it's absolutely appropriate to have heightened attention to what is happening in Xinjiang, to the program of collective repression that the CCP has launched, and to what I view as crimes against humanity that are being committed there. I'm not an expert in the sort of international legal designations on genocide.
And I apologize. I'm wondering more that with the use of that term, which is heightened attention, how do you view that in terms of how China sees itself and both internal and external challenges? Do you think that it sees itself as under even greater attack, and that it must take new steps to respond?
I think it will put China on the defensive, but the reality is that China has been on the defensive about its actions in Xinjiang for a long time. To me, the significant strategic change occurred in the spring of 2017. There was a Central National Security Commission meeting in Beijing, and when Chen Chuanguo, the party secretary of Xinjiang, got back from that meeting, the orders to construct the mass detention facilities went out, and he held a bunch of counterterrorism themed rallies that looked like something out of a Star Wars set. And that's really when there was a strategic inflection point in terms of the CCP's willingness to target people not on the basis of individual behavior, but on the basis of descriptive group characteristics, which is sort of the textbook definition of collective repression, to use a dry academic term. So I think the key question going forward is whether or not the United States is going to be able to marshal an effective international coalition that might have some hope of moderating internal Chinese behavior. When things get defined in terms of national security, the stakes for trying to convince the CCP to walk policies back become extraordinarily high. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the difficulty of that task. But I also think there's a lot that the United States could do, and that I hope the Biden administration will pursue in terms of trying to build a more effective international coalition, for example, among Muslim majority countries, who so far have been relatively quiescent and raised very limited objections to China's behavior. I think it's important that that change, and we need to see what this administration has planned. Otherwise, the term is kind of empty talk, and it's rhetoric without a real strategy behind it, which I think would be in some ways a really, really unfortunate and tragic outcome, not least for all the people who are in detention facilities in Xinjiang today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Talent. Let's turn to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I must say I'm a little tempted to yield my 5 minutes to you and Commissioner Cleveland for a little debate over the PLA, but I guess we can wait until a regular commission meeting for that. Dr. Yunnan, you discussed the importance of targeting our actions, and that was a major theme in the first panel. So I guess I'd like to inquire into how each of you think about that in a little bit more detail from your perspective. And maybe it would be illuminating if I mentioned 3 areas where we have made recommendations in this year's report or last year's report, and just see what you would think the Chinese reaction to that would be, whether you think it would be effective as a means of, deterring aggressive behavior or channeling them in the right direction. So in this year's report, we said the principle of reciprocity ought to govern our actions regarding China's, and that would apply to restraints on media personnel, on diplomats, non-governmental organizations, which the chair mentioned earlier, as well as moving towards regulatory parity, and even as regards markets. And we were pretty strong. That was our #1 recommendation. The last couple of years, we've been recommending that the United States government move towards creating self-sufficiency here, or at least more secure supply chains with regard to pharmaceuticals, so that we were not dependent upon Chinese imports. We had a very targeted recommendation this year that when the government sanctioned a Chinese firm or put it on the entities list, that it apply that sanction as well to any parent companies or organizations. So I'm not going to go through all our recommendations, but I'd like a little more clarity on what kind of targeted actions you think, would work. What can we do? And maybe you want to comment on these recommendations, although you certainly don't have to be exhaustive about it. So I'll let you all take that question wherever you want to go with it.
Should I begin?
Yeah, please.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you for initiating this conversation about a targeted approach. Let me just give an example of a possible targeted approach. So in the realm of innovation, we could begin just by making a very broad distinction between the kinds of applied innovation that I talked about versus the competition over critical technologies. And one possible realm of engagement in innovation is in the realm of climate action, which is a very important priority for the current administration and for China as well. The Chinese innovation landscape is really good at taking an existing technology and making it cheaper, making it more accessible. That's their commercial strength. So that is one example in which the US and China could actually engage on climate action and in the realm of innovation. And that's just one example. And the broader, I think, spillover effects of having selective engagement as at the same time having selective pushback is that I also think that it creates an ecosystem where it makes it easier for individuals and experts like myself to be able to engage with China. Going back to Chairman Bartholomew's earlier comments, the pressure for China experts is not only coming from China, but also from the US. When the two countries are in a very tense climate, we actually are pressured on both sides. So if there can be selective dialogue and selective engagement on areas of mutual interest and cooperation, it actually makes it easier for experts like myself to be able to engage with China and therefore bring expertise back to a healthy and informed discussion.
Why wouldn't reciprocity, for example, though, encourage the right tendencies in Beijing? By letting them look, there's costs. If you're constraining our media, if you're constraining our diplomats, not just ours, but the world's maybe non-governmental organizations, okay, we'll adopt that policy here.
I don't think that the approach of targeting is inconsistent with reciprocity. The reciprocity principle can remain, and it makes complete sense. But at the same time, there can be a targeted approach where there'll be areas where the US wants to push back strongly on certain practices, but be willing to dialogue and engage on other areas. So I don't think that the two are actually inconsistent with each other.
Dr. Fravel, would you like to comment? Or?
Yeah, let me just jump in briefly on the question of reciprocity. And I think one concern that I had certainly last year is it appeared that reciprocity became an end in itself and was no longer a means to achieve something else. And it's also never clear if it was embedded in a larger sort of framework or strategy to create pressure to achieve a desired outcome. So if you take journalists, for example, it's always been the case that they're treated differently in China than they are in the United States. In part, that's because the United States is an open democracy, China is not. But the net result now is we have fewer American journalists reporting on China at a time when knowledge about China has never been more important. So China may have regretted losing some journalists in the United States, although there's still many here. China can very easily learn about the United States from a variety of news sources because we are such an open society. And so I'm not really sure what we gained. I don't think we got a lot of leverage on the media question with China by doing this. And I think we lost access to information at the same time. And so I think in principle, reciprocity can create leverage, but one has to think very carefully about how it's going to be exercised and how it will then be used to bring about the desired outcome. But as a general principle, I think it just can become an end in itself. And I'm not sure if that necessarily advances other policy objectives.
Let me just give one example, if I may, Commissioner, of where I think that reciprocity might be concerning or raise concerns from the standpoint of American national security. And that has to do with the recommendation I made about visa policies. It is no secret that China strategically leverages access to the country itself for researchers, whether they're journalists or academics like those of us on this panel today. And so one of the questions that I have is, in an era when China is closing and making it harder for us to gain important information about its strategic priorities and the way that it organizes to conduct its national security objectives, how do we deal with that closure? And one of the possible ways to do that is to allow Chinese social scientists or officials to come either to the United States or for meetings in third countries. And so what I worry about as I look at this is that I think that the extent of China's national security strategic shift and grand strategy, because it occurred sort of piecemeal over a couple of years, actually didn't get enough attention. And we didn't understand the various implications of China's extraterritorial projection of its internal security goals. And to me, understanding how to read and how to interpret phrasing in Chinese documents. There are things where conversations with Chinese counterparts doesn't signal agreement, right? I think all of us have probably been in circumstances where we go into meetings with Chinese interlocutors and there's a lot of disagreement. And sure, they try to persuade us, we try to persuade them. That's why we do this for a living, is to be able to parse and critically assess the information or the case that's being presented by Chinese interlocutors in that context. But I think we have to be concerned that because we are an open society, loss of that particular access point would disproportionately hurt the United States because we have fewer access points to begin with. And so if you have, 20 ways to understand the United States on one side and 5 ways to understand China, and reciprocity removes 1 on each side, we're down to 4, and China still has 19 ways of interpreting what we're doing. And I'm just not sure that plays out to the U.S.'s, relative benefit.
This has been great. Let's move on next to Commissioner Goodwin, who I believe is on the phone. Cart, can you hear us? And go ahead with your questions if you can.
Is he on the phone, or is he Cart? If you're online, we can't. You're muted.
How's that?
That's good.
Let me. All right, I'm going to try this on the computer. I've been having connection issues, as I'm sure you all have gathered. So I appreciate your patience with me. Things were going way too well there for the first 4 hours. So inevitably, they popped up right as it was my turn.
Actually, it does. It sounds good
questions.
now, Cart.
Dr. Greitens, I wanted to ask you a question about this phrase, prevention and control, which you discussed in your written testimony earlier this afternoon, and you noted the troubling trends of the use of that phrase in both securitizing public health issues as well as the medicalization of public security issues, with phrases such as immunizing against problematic political thinking and excising cancers and the like. I'd like to kind of continue this health metaphor in the public security space and ask you about the risk of misdiagnosis. On our next panel, we're going to talk a little bit, and we've touched on it here, about how the Chinese Communist Party's desire for control and the consolidation of such control reduces the space for critical feedback and for competing ideas, and arguably undermines the integrity of the flow of information that gets to decision makers and becomes reflected in policy decisions. We've certainly seen the dangers of that dynamic play out this past year. And I suppose my question to you is, what additional dangers do you see posed by this dynamic in the coming years? And how can that lack of a critical dialogue and the lack of competing ideas lead to a misdiagnosis of public security issues and resulting mistakes in public security decisions?
Thank you. It's a terrific question. And I was trying to be mindful of time, but yes, it's something that I emphasized a bit more in my written testimony than in my remarks today. If I could add one sort of friendly amendment also, or addition to my previous remarks about American policy on Xinjiang, I think the other piece that I didn't mention because I sort of took it for granted and should not have is the need for America to ensure that we are not ourselves complicit in what's going on in Xinjiang. And so I would just add that as a very short asterisk to my earlier comments on that issue. And I know that's something the Commission has already looked at, so I won't belabor it, but I think it's an important thing to note for the record. I think that the risks of misdiagnosis are real and significant and probably growing with the types of reforms and in particular bureaucratic and informational reforms that China has put in place. My first book actually looked largely at autocratic threat perceptions and concluded that dictators are particularly prone, right? This is a fairly, I'm certainly not the only person to have reached this conclusion, right? But that non-democracies have endemic information problems. Citizens falsify preferences to try and what they say and do publicly to try to avoid being targeted by state repression, and lower level officials misrepresent their activities and the consequences of their activities upward, whether it's to avoid censure or to get promoted. And so information distortions are really sort of hardwired into the system. One of the things I think that we see in China's response to COVID-19 is some of those dynamics at work within the Chinese bureaucracy, and the problems with information flows upwards and horizontally within different parts of the Chinese political system itself. As it relates to public security, there is a very real danger that threats get inflated, because security bureaucracies, particularly if they're ever placed in competition, tend to inflate threats to make themselves or their performance valuable to the key leadership. And so having internal security centralized in one person can be particularly dangerous. The other thing that I worry about is this consolidation of the discipline and supervisory apparatus, and the potential for that to be a separate and more stovepiped line of reporting. And so if you get competing different stovepiped information channels by different bureaucracies that are both involved in coercion and punishment for Xi Jinping, that can actually then escalate threats, escalate repression, and create a sort of a vicious circle for which there actually is no good way for feedback to come in and say, actually, the threat is lower than you think, right? That doesn't ever tend to be the outcome once a system is set up in that particular way. And so I worry that some of the bureaucratic changes we're seeing under Xi Jinping actually heighten the risk of these information problems and prevent the Chinese political system from getting feedback that might lower the temperature when it's appropriate to do so.
Thank you. And with the indulgence of the chair, I wanted to ask a follow-up question to Senator Talent's question. Due to my connection issues, I was unable to hear the witnesses' responses, but was going to pose a somewhat related question based upon the testimony we heard this morning, where it was suggested that we have a finite amount of leverage or engagement that we can use, and perhaps efforts to seek cooperation or engagement on some issues can inhibit our ability to counter and push back against China and others. And just wanted a quick response from the panel on that suggestion.
Commissioner, I largely agreed with the discussion that occurred this morning. I think that it is likely, and we may already be seeing some evidence that China would like to suggest that the U.S. would have to compromise on some issues to make progress on others. And I very much hope the administration will not fall into that line of thinking. I don't think it's necessary or wise.
Thank you.
If I could just add briefly here, if my reading of these sources are correct, and China really does view its environment as kind of more worrisome than it has in the past, that suggests the U.S. has more leverage to be able to push hard on both directions. So if it's something where there is a genuine basis for cooperation, that can be pursued, because I think it can be more effectively sandboxed or isolated from the areas where China might want to draw linkages, because China will see some of this cooperation not just as something that is beneficial for the U.S., but actually is potentially even more beneficial for itself. And that allows for new framings and means that one doesn't need to think necessarily in terms of these kinds of linkages.
Thank you.
My only comment on your question would be that I think it's noteworthy to highlight that U.S. policies have a much more profound effect on Chinese policymaking than vice versa. And I think it's useful to acknowledge that reality. So even the act of a dialogue, and I'm not even talking about cooperation here, even the act of a dialogue, I think can have actually profound influence on the way China perceives itself and its place and its relationship with the US. And you see that in the language of these policy documents, where in the communique, if you compare the communique with, say, the inaugural address, the U.S. is on page 1 under the euphemism, a complex international situation. Whereas if you think about an inaugural address in the U.S. context, China actually doesn't appear. So the U.S. really actually has disproportionate influence in the way the Chinese perceive themselves and make their policies. So even a withdrawal of sanctions and even a little bit of showing of dialogue, I think can go a long way. And mixing that with, as I've said, the necessary pushback into a targeted approach.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Commissioner Borkoff, we turn to you now. You're still muted. Bob, you're muted.
Better. You know, when your last name begins with a B or a W on this commission, you get to either be first or last. And a lot of the questions that I was really concerned with have been asked, and that just opened me up in listening to ask this. All three of our folks who have testified today have really impressed me with your breadth of knowledge and your strategic thinking. And Dr. Ong, you know, your concern and your suggestion that we find avenues to make people feel more comfortable, I totally agree with. Dr. Fravel, when you talked about the concerns the Chinese have with defensive sovereignty, I really understand that as a business guy, because when you build a business, you know, you fight like crazy to get to a certain size, and then when you get there, you worry every single day that someone's going to take it away from you. And Dr. Grayton's, what struck me in your very first comments talking about prevention and control, you said that they look at security more as an ends than a means. And that really struck home for me. I have a very close friend who grew up in business with me and built a gigantic restaurant company. And last year when the pandemic hit, he was very, very, very upset with the way the PPP got handled, because he didn't understand why his billion-dollar company was being attacked for getting so much money. And he said, you know, I'm a small business too. And I said, and it reminded me of what you all are talking about today with China downplaying themselves and saying they're a developing country. And I said, you know, no offense, but you're really not a small business. And he said, I'm 500 small businesses. That's just not true. And where I'm leading with this is that the psychological difference between what's happening in China and the people who run it and their governmental system, I realized today, listening to you all, really can be misunderstood just because they use the same words. That's a very, very big concern. So I also know from just watching my friends who build these big companies that are not all that different than China. They want to control the marketplace once they get to a certain place. And they can be beaten is the wrong word, manipulated it might be too strong a word, but they can be influenced to do the right thing if you understand their psychology. So what I want to ask, starting with Dr. Greitens and then Dr. Ong and then Dr. Fravel, is if you had to choose the one psychological position, ploy, tactic on the leaders of China, what would you try to affect? What area would you, because just talking to them will not make them, it will open the door to listen, but they're not going to change their behavior. What will change their behavior if reciprocity doesn't and these other threats we make don't work? What do we need to do, make them feel secure enough and trust us enough to actually make a change? Or is it strictly going to be just threat?
So unfortunately, based on the work that I've done on autocracies in different historical periods and across the world, I'm not sure that solving the insecurity issue is actually possible, given the nature of the political system and the leadership that China has. And so I think we need to figure out how to bound the actions that result from it. I think we need to understand it, bound it, and that it should be about protecting and defending American interests and American values. And I know the discussion this morning touched on some techniques to do that. And I say that because I think it is possible for a country to be both very powerful and insecure at the same time. Power does not always create a perception of security. And the old joke when I was studying Chinese is that we look at China and we multiply everything by 1.3 billion or 1.4 billion. Chinese leaders look at it and they divide by 1.3 or 1.4 billion. And so just even the size of China plays in different ways, right? As Professor Ang's comment about the monthly income of most Chinese households earlier made clear. The final thing I'll say is that, a lot of the problems that we highlight in our testimony, I think it's important to be aware that the Chinese political system is also aware of and actively trying to solve these issues, right? So Commissioner Goodwin's question earlier about information problems, right? That there's a concept that Premier Li Keqiang has used called information islands that appears throughout efforts to reform Chinese bureaucracy right now. The Chinese political system is aware that the fragmentation of information is a problem for the leadership and is actively trying to figure out what to do about it. The problem is that it's more of a political problem than a technological or a bureaucratic one. And so a lot of American policy needs to be, I think, sort of accepting of that reality, even as we hope that it'll evolve and change. But I think we need to focus more on American interests and American values. And really for that to lead our strategy.
Thank you. Dr. Ong?
Well, thank you very much for your really thoughtful comments. You raise a profound question, and I'm not sure if I can answer it in 3 minutes, but I do have a few thoughts that I would like to emphasize. I think the issue may be less of a psychological tactic, as you said, but an understanding that I think it's helpful for the US at the outset to question the assumption that the CCP is a monolith, that the CCP leadership is a monolith, that they act and think in one mind and agree on everything. If you think about it, it's not a realistic assumption. We know from historical experience that every government has divides. And we know from the Soviet Union that even the Soviet Union was deeply divided and Stalin was condemned by his successor. So I think it's actually realistic to assume that there are differences and divides within the CCP. But because in the past years, the relationship has been one where they were all bundled together, think about the implications of that action. If assuming that within the party, you do have people who are moderate reformers versus hardliners, when you bundle them all together and react to them in an aggressive way, that almost always strengthens the hand of the hardliners, and the moderates and reformers find themselves really in a double whammy. They are repressed both domestically by the repressive climate, as well as by US pressure, because they're just bundled together with their colleagues whom they do not necessarily agree with. So I think at the outset, it's helpful to realize it's not a monolith. The other thing I would point out is that the US does have a lot of leverage over China. And one simple leverage is that China really wants to dialogue with the US. They do want to have a better relationship because it's in their interest. And I think if the US can signal that we're willing to talk, but we really want to talk with the right people. We want to talk with the people who are open to market reforms, who support the private sector, who are not into over ambitions and creating a China-led order and so on. We want to talk to people who are more on the lines of Deng. Then I think that actually can have a powerful effect on changing the dynamics within China. I'm not saying that the US should attempt to change China. I don't think that's realistic, but I do think that the US should be aware that it does have certain leverage to influence Chinese politics in a positive direction. At least it should not be helping the hardliners to have an upper hand. Thank you.
Thank you. That description, by the way, sounded a little bit like some of my friends here in America today. Dr. Vervelde, go ahead.
Thanks. It's a great question, and also invites almost philosophical responses in the same way. And it's hard to add to what Dr. Greitens and Dr. Ong have mentioned. I guess let me make 2 points. The first is, I guess, a bit more narrow. But if one reflects on kind of the change in U.S. policy towards China in the last year, it obviously had a very strong kind of moralizing component to it, right? To basically blame China for lots of different things, maybe rightly, maybe wrongly, do so in a very public way. And of course, that may have been viewed as a way to get leverage or build policy support, but I don't think it certainly led to any real changes in China's behavior. And in fact, probably helped elicit some of the Wolf Warrior sort of diplomatic responses. I talked a little bit about this in a written testimony. So I think simply how one talks about a relationship with another major country in the world is important. And there are different ways one can talk about China while still recognizing all the challenges that it faces. And one could consider different ways of doing it that have been done in the last 12 to 24 months. More concretely, though, one could be equally philosophical about international relations theory and think about deterrence and reassurance, right? So if you want to deter someone from doing something, you have to assure them what you won't do. So if the U.S. wants to exercise leverage over China in a certain area, if it believes that's in U.S. interest, and it believes the outcome will be positive, it's worth pursuing, but at the same time, you have to signal what you won't do. And I'm not sure much of our discussion or our thinking has really thought about that element of it either. Right, China is a big country; it has its interests. It's going to want to pursue those interests. I think, as Dr. Greitens really artfully laid out earlier, right, in her view of this much more holistic notion of national security. And so, when thinking about how to gain leverage or thinking about where U.S. leverage might lie and how to exercise that, this is an important question to ask: is as you exercise that leverage, what is it specifically targeted on? What are you trying to achieve? And then what are you actually not trying to achieve? And what assurances will you provide on the other side? That actually may lead to more policy movement because it's more sort of targeted in a way, to go back to our earlier discussion. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you much. I have a few minutes to ask my own questions, and they're going to be focused to Dr. Greitens and Dr. Fravel. And the framing piece is the India-China border dispute of June of last year. So, Dr. Greitens, I'm fascinated by your description of a new grand strategy with interlocking consideration of foreign and internal security threats. Can we mute? I'm getting a back. Okay, thank you. And the sense that you talked about, where there's actually a proactive element in which the CCP apparatuses could act in an early fashion when it perceives a threat to itself. The challenge of this grand strategy, it appears to give the predominance of consideration to domestic interests. And so in the case of the Sino-Indian border war, the evidence I've seen, and Taylor can correct this if wrong, but the evidence I've seen suggests that this was intentional on the part of the Chinese side, that they rotated in different troops just prior to the confrontation, and suggesting that they knew what was going to happen and it was part of a plan. But what was left out is the consideration of how counterproductive this is to China's general consideration regionally, right? The views of China among regional states as to why it precipitated this mini crisis at this point, it's just not understood. And so I guess the question is, how do we account for these? If there is an interlocking nature of domestic and external threats, how do we account for that in trying to understand Chinese actions, especially when they just don't seem to make sense and they appear to be counterproductive to China, what we understand to be China's interests? Dr. Fravel, for you, you talked about the profound changes that China acknowledges in 2020. I tend to share your views on the unlikeliness of major regional conflict precipitated by China. But I wonder if those 5 reasons you give in your written testimony are themselves tested by this era of profound changes, right? And in particular, thinking about the Sino-Indian border events of last year, do they potentially misunderstand or have a lack of appreciation on the topic of conventional escalation control? Right? We know there's a mutual agreement to not use weapons, to not shoot live bullets at each other on the Sino-Indian border war. So there's a natural escalation control that's been put in place. So the soldiers that died were bludgeoned to death or beaten with stones or drowned in the river. I mean, really medieval forms of conflict. The point is, do they have an appreciation? Does the PLA, do the Chinese top military and security leadership have an appreciation for the ways in which even conventional conflicts might spiral out of control? So those are my two questions. Dr. Greitens, first to you.
Save the tough one for the end, huh? Well, thank you, Commissioner. I'll give you part of an answer and then defer to Dr. Fravel, who's written an entire book on China's handling of maritime and territorial disputes. And so I'm interested in his thoughts. Like many people, I find some of the Chinese decision-making in this particular instance puzzling. And this is, I think, a real example of the question that arose earlier about who drives security decision-making in certain instances and whether or not it's consistent even across different issues that we would kind of group under this issue of or heading of national security decision-making. Let me say a couple of things. First, a long-term strategic goal vis-a-vis the resolution of this dispute does not preclude tactical opportunism. And so I think we need to keep in mind that those are not mutually exclusive alternatives. Second, China tends to, I think one of the implications of this preventive framework, as opposed to even a preemptive framework, which is the way I would characterize the shift under Xi Jinping, even pushing even earlier toward prevention rather than preemption, is an oversensitivity to any potentially threatening indicator. And so, for example, there's been some suggestion that road building activity on the Indian side of this area could have somehow precipitated Chinese behavior. I think it's important to remember that that's not saying it justifies the behavior, because one of the implications of this preventive framework is that you'll get things that are disproportionately reactive to those kinds of developments that might have otherwise not produced this level of response. The final issue I'll say is that, what we see in CCP rhetoric and the rhetoric around the comprehensive national security concept is that border security and diasporas become really, really important and potentially threatening from a security standpoint to Xi Jinping. And so I think, China's approach to borders, right? The Fifth Plenum had this phrase about creating a protective screen, which isn't a direct reference, I think, to borders, but gets at this idea of protecting the inside from outside penetration that's harmful. But the other issue here is that diaspora populations become a real security issue because they are, to use the classic phrase, outside the state or outside the territory, but inside the people, inside the body politic. And so I think that's also part of why you tend to see so much security emphasis or a change in security policies toward the Chinese diaspora, up to and including, in American higher education where I sit. So those are a few thoughts that only take us part of the way to a complete answer, but let me stop and defer to Dr. Fravel on the rest of it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner Camphausen. Great. Actually, both questions are terrific and challenging. So on your question specifically to me, I guess I would make 2 points. First, right, in PLA writings, there's certainly there's an awareness, right, that uncontrolled escalation is a problem. So, I think, one of the terms is guangkong, right? Sort of manage and control crises to prevent them from escalating. And more generally, China has a tradition with respect to using force to framing it in quite political terms, trying to figure out the political effect they want to have with the military action versus sort of just brute force or taking and seizing something. So I think there absolutely is an awareness. And if one even looks at kind of sort of China's history of the use of force, one can see this sort of awareness or this political use of force playing out in a lot of different contexts. That said, it would seem to have backfired in this particular instance, right? As you know, Tim, I don't have a particularly good explanation for that, which is today, of course, right? just because China writes about the fact that force should be controlled doesn't necessarily mean that they're always able to do that. And there were probably also events, tactically that led to the situation that culminated, in the clash in the Golan Valley in mid-June. So I'm not sure that's a complete answer to your question. I guess the other final point I would make is immediately after the clash, I think China certainly realized, right, that the situation had spun out of control. And they went into pretty significant damage control mode, talked about, resetting relations with India. Of course, at that point, it fell on deaf ears in New Delhi, right, because of what happened. But I cite that only to say that I do think there was an awareness in this particular instance, right, that it was mishandled in a pretty significant way. Now, where we are today, right, is with who knows how many, according to Indian press reports, 50 to 60,000 soldiers from each side, not necessarily immediately a sort of eyeball to eyeball, but certainly in the vicinity of the line of actual control, and in the Spangor Gap, right, in an area where you can actually, use some armor. And do more than sort of mountain infantry operations, which itself I think is a worrisome situation. On the plus side, it's the middle of winter, and if you think Massachusetts is cold, I invite you to the Kalish Mountain Range, right? I mean, it's very cold and very hard to do things. But yeah, as the snow melts, you're going to have a lot of forces in proximity to each other, and I think it will be a real test and very important to watch. Thank you.
Thanks very much. As with the first panel, we would invite our witnesses to for your consideration in responding to questions for the record that we would reach out to you with, and look forward to continued follow-up with you all. We're a couple minutes over time, so let's adjourn for the second panel, take a short break, and return at 2:45 p.m. Eastern. Unless the chair wants to.
Yeah, let's reconvene here at 2:50 so the people have 10 minutes.
Thank you again.
You all. Thanks. Our third panel today will assess the implications of China's domestic political dynamics and economic, security, and foreign policy goals for the United States. It will also explore potential challenges China will face in accomplishing its goals. First, we welcome back Dr. Jacqueline Deal, President and CEO of the Long-Term Strategy Group, a Washington, D.C.-based defense consultancy. Her recent work includes an analysis of the security implications of alternative Chinese futures and assessment of China's capacity for technological innovation. For the last 14 years, she has worked with the director of the Office of the Secretary of Defense Net Assessment on projects related to East Asia. Dr. Deal will address the political challenges China faces and the implications for the United States. Next, we welcome back Mr. Daniel Rosen, founding partner of the Rhodium Group. Mr. Rosen's work focuses on U.S.-China policy dynamics, interpretation of Chinese economic policy indicators, and assessment of long-term Chinese reform policies. He is an adjunct professor of international and public affairs at Columbia University. From 2000 to 2001, he served as a senior advisor for international economic policy at the White House National Economic Council and National Security Council. At some point, I think we need a competition for who had the longest title on their business cards. Mr. Rosen will address China's economic challenges and implications for the United States. Finally, all the way from Australia, we welcome Mr. Peter Jennings, Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI, a defense and strategic policy think tank based in Canberra. His research focuses on Australian and regional defense policies, crisis management, government decision-making, and future defense capabilities. He has worked at senior levels in the Australian Public Service on defense and national security, including as Deputy Secretary for Strategy in the Defense Department, Chief of Staff to the Minister of Defense, and Senior Advisor for Strategic Policy to the Prime Minister. I hope that was all at one time, all that title. Mr. Jennings will address the implications of China's security and foreign policy challenges. Forgive my cat. I'd like to remind the witnesses to please keep your remarks as close as possible to 7 minutes to leave time for the question and answer session. Dr. Deal, we will begin with you. You're muted. You're muted.
Thank you. Thank you to today's chairs, Chairman Bartholomew and Co-Chair Camphausen, and to the other honorable commissioners for the invitation to testify. I appreciate the opportunity to contribute to the very important work of the commission, and would also like to thank the staff for their support of my appearance today. It's fitting that this first hearing of 2021 is both retrospective, marking the centennial of the Chinese Communist Party, and prospective, because the party's past is clearly an essential factor shaping how the People's Republic of China will evolve in the coming years. You asked me to address a variety of questions about the domestic and international challenges that the CCP faces, known and unknown to the party, and the party's ability to deal with them, as well as their potential implications for the PRC's behavior abroad and for U.S. interests. My answers inspired a range of suggested recommendations to Congress. Some focus on the consequences of CCP success and are designed to sharpen our competitive approach. Others focus on the potential for a major discontinuity in the PRC. Where do I get this wide range of potential outcomes? First, as others have testified, the CCP's ambition for the PRC to secure global ascendancy is no longer in question, and Xi Jinping seems to be in a hurry. He's advanced the deadline for the People's Liberation Army to be a world-leading force from 2049, the PRC Centennial, to 2027, the PLA Centennial, and appears to have lifted the cap on the share of the PRC's GDP that goes to the PLA. Some combination of perceived opportunities, and perhaps also pressures building up within the PRC, are driving this rush. We are likely to misunderstand what is happening if we apply Western frameworks, though, because the CCP system is just very different from ours. While the party is comfortable, clearly, navigating interactions with the Western liberal world, its own policies reflect an evolving Chinese Marxist perspective on global power. This orientation is materialist and zero-sum, to address an exchange from the first panel this morning. The party worries about securing the PRC's access to outside resources that it needs, from food to energy to intellectual property. Party theorists deliberate on and debate new policies with reference to empirical trends that they conceive of as illuminating scientific laws of history. They start from a common ideology about the centrality of the party itself in governing the PRC and promoting its rise to world-leading status. They believe that the CCP regime is better positioned than the United States is to adapt to the information technology and digital economy developments likely to determine victory in 21st century major power competition. The state will play an essential role in ensuring that the PRC dominates what it calls the commanding heights of the important new domains from the network or cyber realm to space, which the party sees as central to geopolitical contestation in what they call the new era. That said, some theorists recognize pitfalls associated with the party's approach. For instance, the way in which the anti-corruption campaign that Xi has used to centralize power disincentivizes initiative on the part of officials who may calculate that inaction is safer than actions for which they may be blamed. For similar reasons, PRC scholar strategists also worry that the political system reduces the likelihood that good information about what is happening at the local level will be transmitted up the chain of authority. They also diagnose that the international environment has become more challenging for the CCP's continued rise, insofar as foreign interlocutors are more suspicious of Beijing than they used to be. But overall, they have confidence that the party, by virtue of its theorizing and mastery of the important developments of our time, will succeed. They may not appreciate the degree of risk they incur by putting all their faith in the party itself. Domestically, the party's fallibility has been cast into relief by the relative failure of the PRC's COVID-19 vaccines. If the same compromised information flows that induced Xi Jinping to boast that the party would provide the vaccine as a global public good also lead to an underestimation of other public health challenges or infrastructure problems or environmental issues, the impact could be catastrophic. And there are other examples from recent history of the party not anticipating second and third order effects of its domestic policies. Externally, again, because of their confidence in the party's playbook, they are likely to double down on the behavior that they have engaged in over the past decade, combining threats and coercion with efforts to co-opt foreign elites whom they see as friends or potential allies. But it is possible that the party could miscalibrate this combination or grow frustrated if the targets of coercion prove resistant, or as the cost of wooing foreign friends rises in the wake of the Xinjiang genocide and the Hong Kong crackdown. Looking back at the PRC's history, at moments when the tide seems to be shifting against the party has authorized the initiation of hostilities, so-called lesson teaching attacks, or political uses of warfare, as was discussed on the previous panel, in an effort not to wage a prolonged war, but rather to use a short conflict in which it can exploit local or discrete functional advantages and capabilities to send a broader message to the world, that is, to try to assert China's perceived prerogatives and status. The PLA buildup on the border with India today is worrisome in this regard. If such an attack were to succeed, it would advance the party's interests at the expense of those of the United States and the open world by reducing faith in the alternative to the PRC model. So we face a wide range of potential outcomes from the PRC, even as the party maintains its ideological outlook and continues to execute the approaches that it has applied to date. For this reason, my recommendations start with ways to compete harder or better, but also include preparatory steps for potential major Chinese discontinuities or downside scenarios. 3 recommendations related to sharpening our competitive approach are: 1, the Commission might recommend that Congress ask the State Department to track the CCP's progress at synicizing Marxism, to shine a light on this endeavor, which is not often discussed or often enough discussed in English or in the West. 2, it might recommend that Congress ask the Defense Department to develop courses of action to deter or dissuade the PRC from launching a lesson-teaching war against India or any other potential target. 3, it might recommend that Congress ask the Federal Bureau of Investigation and any other relevant intelligence agencies to supply DoD with an inventory of all known targets of PRC espionage in the United States to illuminate which technologies we have that they most fear or want and need to plug their own gaps as an input to the Defense Department's development of competitive strategies for the competition with the PRC. And I'll conclude with recommendations related to potential PRC discontinuities. The Commission could consider recommending to Congress that it task the relevant agencies with developing contingency plans in the event of a PRC internal crisis, to include research, analysis, and simulations designed to address questions such as what would be the most important U.S. interests in such a scenario in the short and medium terms, over the long term, with whom inside and outside the PRC would the United States work to ensure the protection of U.S. interests in these different timeframes? And finally, what are the indicators that such a discontinuity might be imminent? Who within the U.S. government is monitoring those indicators? So thank you very much again, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rosen. Sorry, Dr. Deal. Mr. Rosen, on to you.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to be speaking with the commission again. Chairman Bartholomew, Commissioner Camphausen, and colleagues on the commission, thanks for the opportunity to offer my perspectives today on the implications of China's policies for U.S. interests. I'm going to address three of the questions that were suggested to me. First, we seek to understand what economic challenges are confronting Beijing right now and how they affect U.S. economic interests. China's leaders describe their present goal as maintaining stable progress toward prosperity while transitioning from growth quantity to growth quality. That's a reasonable goal for them. China's GDP per capita in 2019 was still just a little over $10,000 per person, just above Argentina, Mexico, Bulgaria. So growth is essential to China and the party at home and abroad to its ambitions. And it's entirely possible given the low starting point that they're still at, provided that China can realize its potential. But there are tremendous problems for them behind the veneer of unvarying success that they present. Economies grow through three ways: labor force demographics, capital stock deepening, or productivity growth. China's story of reform and opening was foremost about letting markets guide more productive use of labor and capital to produce value over the decades after 1978. And that propelled China very well for many years, but past moves don't sustain growth forever. The working age population in China peaked, the working size population peaked in 2014 and will decrease outright by 2030. China has underinvested terribly in health and education for more than 750 million of its non-urban citizens, as my good friend Scott Rozelle has so ably documented. The capital stock of the country grew 11% per year from 2010 to 2017, compared to just over 1% for the US, but with ever diminishing return on investment for all that money they're putting to work. It takes almost 9 renminbi of new credit today to drive just 1 renminbi of GDP growth. That's almost 3 times the amount that was needed in a decade prior to Xi Jinping taking power. So it's taking a huge amount more money to get the same amount of growth out of China. And that kind of thing just doesn't go on forever. With demographic shrinkage and limits to debt-driven growth, a productivity boom is the only way for China to get to high income status on which all of its aspirations to 2027 or 2049 or what have you are all completely contingent. However, China is trending in the wrong direction here on productivity as well. Productivity contributed only 0.6 percentage points to their average GDP growth 2014 to 2018, compared to 2.1 points a year in the 5 years prior to that. So not in the right direction in terms of that third option for growth. The Xi era began with a plan to address all those challenges, but implementation of that plan proved too scary whenever it led to instability, which was all the time. Capital account opening was started and then suspended. Interbank market cleanup was turned on and then turned off. State-owned enterprise governance reforms were begun and then canceled. Over and over and over again, Beijing fell back on statist solutions, sending in officials to determine market outcomes. While politically expedient now, and that really shined bright during the pandemic year, reverting to a state-owned playbook disregards the lessons of the past and will not take China forward into the future. The first implication of all this for the US is that China cannot actually negotiate on structural matters if it does not resolve its internal barriers to marketization. Without market-driven productivity, Beijing will need to keep an iron grip on its system to keep it from faltering, and private and foreign interests will be disadvantaged. And that means it's not going to be able to truly be a good actor in serious negotiations over structural matters with us. If we cannot negotiate progressive economic arrangements, strife will ensue, I would caution and counsel. If China is unable to build a market system at home, it will prefer to change market systems abroad so as not to be offsides and out of alignment with global trends. This was one thing when China was just a percent or two of the global GDP decades ago when I started my career. Today, they're 16% of global GDP and 30% of marginal GDP growth. And so that disinclination to stay on the track of marketization is completely problematic, as we all know. The second implication is that despite strong 2020 economic performance, the China we're dealing with is actually quite brittle. Both the global benefits it delivers to those commercial entities that want to engage with the terms it offers, and also the security risks it presents must be at least questioned to see if they need discounting. China's an important source of revenue for US firms and commodity and raw material exporters, but major segments of Chinese growth, such as the property sector, are inevitably going to be sidelined before very long. Meanwhile, security analysts in the US and elsewhere often presume that Beijing's breathless long-term growth target should be taken at face value, whereas in fact, they absolutely cannot. And I spend a lot of time talking to leaders directly, including in the strategic sector, about how big a difference there is between some of our policy planning and the realities. The other 2 points I wanted to make, which I don't have time to fully read in, even what I had in my my shortened spoken remarks, are first on China's attraction as a development partner. This diagnosis I've offered of problems in the Chinese economic system has profound implications for whether China can be the same kind of development partner it promises many developing countries to be. We've already seen a lot of debate the past year about Belt and Road outlays kind of falling short of what Beijing had suggested they would be. I can speak quite a lot about that. And finally, I was going to speak to, and I have in my written remarks, decoupling talk abroad and what it means for changes being made in Beijing about their own policy planning. Dual circulation, in most ways, is China's acknowledgement that its hopes for its global engageability have changed, and that the world is not going to simply reset or go back to status quo anti-Donald Trump. That's not possible. To close up, in terms of a quick recommendation, I've offered these before the Senate, for instance, but 3 quick P's to keep in mind. Whatever decoupling and disengagement we do, make it partial. We don't have a compelling reason to cut off everything, unlike what some in late Trump period thought. Number 2, make it provisional if possible, make it reversible, because when the Chinese people and even parts of the party try to reverse course to get back on track and out of the problem they're in, we're going to want to be able to offer them a way forward and not just doors closed across the board. And third and finally, make it as peaceful as possible. Just because we have to disengage doesn't mean we should do it with any joy or that bellicosity should be the prevalent American tone. It's not a good look for us, and it'll long be remembered by the Chinese people what mood we took into this period of our relationship in the future. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. Mr. Jennings.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be speaking to the committee today. I will very quickly go through some highlights from the written comments that I've provided you. I just wanted to start by thanking the Commission for its work in saying that it actually has resonance well beyond the United States. It's an important factor in policy thinking in Australia, and I'm sure many other countries as well. Now, I was asked to address a number of questions, the first being what challenges do China's leaders anticipate in strengthening China's global appeal and achieving its status, its desired status in the international order. That reminded me of a conversation I once had with a very senior Indonesian political figure who said to me once, Peter, China has no soft power in Southeast Asia, it has only money power. But the point I would say about that is that money power has an appeal all of its own, including in countries like Australia. Another factor which goes to how countries in the Indo-Pacific think about China is that they very much calibrate their judgments about China based on an assessment of the longevity of American commitment to the security in the Asia-Pacific region. And so those two things in the minds of Southeast Asian policymakers, Pacific Island policymakers, sit very much together. I think in recent years, what we've seen from Beijing is that their primary objective is to achieve their strategic aims. And it doesn't matter so much to them if, in fact, they are losing the soft power battle and indeed being perceived more negatively by countries in the region while they do it. Now, my own government would not put it in these terms to you, but in the South Pacific and Southeast Asia, these are currently zones of intense competition for influence between the PRC and the United States and its allies. And that competition, I think, is going to only become significantly hotter in the short term and in coming years. That led to the second question that was put to me, which was what impact will political pressures of the CCP centenary have on the party's willingness to use military force or other coercive measures abroad. On that, I would say I think the centenary is something which Xi Jinping can use to strengthen his personal position within the party and the party's position within the country. It's clearly going to be a major focus for propaganda, and it's clear that the PLA is going to be a significant part of that propaganda effort. My judgment is that Xi Jinping is ready to exploit any opportunity for possible aggression against Taiwan. Whether that opportunity is going to be exercised depends on his calculation of risk and also China's capacity to carry out a military activity and the likely American response. On risk, it seems clear to me that China's use of its military, its Coast Guard and other security entities shows that Xi Jinping is willing to take on more risky activities. And that's not least because it's shown that risk can pay off. We've seen that in the South China Sea. We've seen it in his almost cost-free treatment of Australia, the economic coercion that's been handed out to Australia without a large international response being geared. We've seen it in terms of China's failure to manage the virus, but without an effective international response being developed to sheet that blame home. However, on risk, it seems to me that because he has the capacity to, Xi Jinping is prepared to take more risk. And I think the big factor governing his calculations around Taiwan is going to be the credibility of America's commitment to the country. I was then asked about does Beijing understand the limitations and have concerns about the capacity of the PLA to undertake complex military operations? The answer to that is yes. But I think the point to make to the commissioners here is that we're not in the business of making assessments about whether or not the PLA is going to develop into the perfect force. It just has to be good enough to deliver the strategic objectives that China wants it to deliver, that Xi Jinping wants it to deliver. Let me finish by going to some recommendations. Perhaps because this is the first time I was talking to the Commission, I got ambitious and I came up with 6 recommendations for you, and I'll skim through those just very quickly. The first one is, I think it's immensely important for you to understand the value of your work to democracies around the world, not simply in terms of America's interests. And so promote an alignment of democracies to counter malign CCP influence. I think you can play an international role by cooperating more closely with like-minded democracies and democratic legislatures. So why not, for example, think about establishing a regular dialogue on the PRC amongst the elected representatives of the Five Eyes countries. Secondly, I would be reaching out to capable democratic legislatures to develop a shared program of research. And I would suggest reach out to the Australian Parliament, to the Speaker of our House of Representatives, to the President of our Senate. We have a pretty capable, reasonably well-funded committee system in the Australian Parliament. And I think an approach which agreed some shared activities would be useful. What would I focus that on? Well, I think the Commission should focus on Southeast Asia as an emerging critical zone of strategic competition. what happens in Southeast Asia over the next 2 years is really going to shape the success or failure of the United States in Asia more broadly. Next, I would look at the South Pacific, and I would simply make a point that we are dealing with very fragile polities here, easily corrupted by money, desperately in need of support from well-meaning democracies that are prepared to work with the Pacific Island countries. 2 points which I'll just go through very quickly. One is I work a lot with members of Parliament here in Australia, all of whom are really desperately looking for information that they can put to their own electors to explain to them the complexities of dealing with China in the international environment. A toolkit for politicians developed by the Commission to explain these strategic complexities to their electors would be a really valuable thing. And finally, and perhaps most desperately important, we need to do more to help Taiwan, which is critical to regional security and critical also to America's credibility as a security partner. My paper does cover some of the things that might be included in that, but I do see that as being a critical task for the Commission, particularly in this year. And I'll finish my comments at this point. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you to the three of you for interesting, thought-provoking testimony. We're going to start out our questions with Commissioner Camphausen.
Thank you very much, Chair. I echo her comments about how fascinating your testimony was. I have 3 questions. Dr. Deal, first for you. You speak to the centrality of Xi Jinping's role as leader, about the limited options in terms of leadership to his approach. And then you, perhaps alarmingly, and I'm sure intentionally so, talk about Mao's, the centrality of Mao's leadership during the Great Leap Forward, suggesting, at least to me as a reader, that the possibility of catastrophic, not just marginal, but catastrophic error that the Chinese party state might bring about as a result of miscalculation on the part of Xi himself is a very real near-term possibility. Tell me if I'm reading too much into your statements or if you would otherwise qualify that.
Thank you for the question, and thank you again for the opportunity. I have to be careful because I think my point was when you have a system that is as ambitious and centralized and different from ours as the CCP regime is, I think we can't discount, possibilities, a wide array of possibilities on either end of the spectrum, from their success, which at this point I think would, bear huge costs for the free and open world and its prospects on the one hand, to major terrible decisions or mistakes and very bad outcomes ensuing from those. And, in some sense, the COVID-19 pandemic, however you want to trace its cause, it seems to have come out of Wuhan, China, and we are already bearing, globally catastrophic costs. And we don't know even the level of the suffering that went on in China, and people have been quick to respond to Chinese efforts to claim credit for locking everything down and containing it. But the way that they did that was so foreign. I mean, they did things that we couldn't do and wouldn't do and think of doing, and the problem appears to have come from there. So in some sense, we don't need to look much farther than recent history to realize that, things we never would have dreamed about last year or the year before last coming to pass from China are now possible or seem to be possible. So that's one way of putting it. And I can't emphasize enough, how likely we are to deceive ourselves or make big mistakes if we assume that, they're on a track to be more like us or just like us, or that our policy frameworks we can impute to them.
Thank you. Mr. Rosen, one of the conclusions I drew from reading your testimony and listening to your prepared remarks is that the preponderance of economic factors favor the United States and our interests. And that given that, a reasonable approach might be to play for time, play the longer game, take a breath, tone down the rhetoric, let the fundamentals play out in ways that serve U.S. advantages over the medium to longer term. Now, I'm asking you to respond to my characterization in 2 sentences of your lengthy statement and oral remarks, but come back at me in response to that.
The trick with me is always keeping it to 2 sentences, but I would say nothing is further from my from my sense, actually. While I do think that I'm still long liberalism, I think liberalism ultimately works a hell of a lot better. And I think China's kind of illiberalism prevents them from self-correcting their own flaws, and we know this from history. However, they are a $15 trillion economy with 1.4 billion people and a tremendous amount of narrative throw weight around the world, and people that are believing the surface version of the Chinese story. And I mean, they believe their own story, and their success has a lot of momentum right now. And ours, we are really, punching ourselves in the face over and over again, a lot of things we're doing on our side. So this is a 2-sided equation. Their side is batting above its true weight. And, that's not necessarily just going to revert back to normal soon enough to serve our interests. And we're not protecting and shoring up our own side of the equation. So needs a lot of more conversation, but in no way are things right now business as usual okay. But I do think if we don't screw this up, I'd rather have our cards than theirs for sure.
Thank you. Chair, if I may have a third question?
Yes, go ahead.
Mr. Jennings, your testimony talks about the greater risk that the PRC under Xi and Xi himself might be willing to take. There's obviously the potential for miscalculation, and I invite you to make any comment you have there. But my real question is about, is there any means, is there any entity, is there any person who provides the restraint? Is there a governor, a natural governor, or is you could say, is China an engine that's running full out, the governor is wide open?
Commissioner, thank you. Look, I can't see what that sense of restraint might be, other than perhaps a sort of a cultural disposition to worry about the weakness of China, which I think does still inform a lot of decision making. I mean, look, I agree, I think, with my co-panelists that Xi Jinping has made some shockingly bad decisions over the last few years, and yet still seems to have the capacity to carry them through without anyone attempting to moderate his views. The sort of unrolling of wolf warrior diplomacy, I think, is a prime example of that, which has really lost a huge amount of goodwill, which used to be there for China through the region. His treatment of Australia means he's kind of lost the Australian heart and mind for a generation. And so whether these things may deliver some short-term positives for China, but I think long-term that they are really disastrous. I think Xi Jinping is, in some respects, taking a page from Vladimir Putin's playbook in terms of the audacity of using risk to achieve strategic objectives, starting with the effective annexation of the South China Sea. And the point that I make in my paper, Commissioner, is that essentially Xi Jinping has been able to take a number of risky gambles in terms of his engagement with the United States, promising not to militarize the islands, promising to walk back on cyber spying, in the handling of the virus, in the unrolling of wolf warrior diplomacy. And at each of those arguably strategic blunders, he's been able to get away with it because the United States and the West has been unable to develop a shared, coherent response. Now, if you're Xi Jinping in 2021, might that not lead you to think that it's worth taking a few more risks over Taiwan at this moment when America is in the state that it's in, when the West is distracted and not really interested in large-scale investments in military capability? Yes, I think that his attitude to risk has changed. I think it's making him much more dangerous. And I think the only thing that's really going to put some brakes on that is not what will happen internally. It's how we will be collectively able to respond to him.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. Vice Chairman Cleveland? Is she there? No, all right, temporarily. Let's move on to Commissioner Borokoff.
Thank you all. Different viewpoint today from some of you. Dr. Rosen, or Mr. Rosen, you talked about the fundamentals in China and the fact that they're clearly not what they're broadcasting. And the world press talks about the phenomenal success they're having, which apparently doesn't have proper underpinning. So my question is, do you believe that this incredible increase in investment by our companies into their stock market is dangerous for those investors in America today?
Thank you. So, I mean, China is achieving tremendous successes. However, the question is the cost side, whether the amount of capital being amassed into that, whether other social priorities, be it rural education, environmental cleanup, things like that, are being adequately addressed. I don't think that the totality of the Chinese model growth as we see it right now is at all sustainable, or does it present a development model for the rest of the world? But that doesn't mean that the semblance of modernity in Shanghai is somehow smoke and mirrors. It's not. There are tremendous, tremendous achievements in China as well. As for foreign direct investment into China, which is something that Rhodium Group looks at very closely, I would say this, that the vast majority of foreign money going into China is being intermediated by professional firms and investors who understand the risks that they're grappling with. On a short-term basis, Chinese debt is paying very high yield, the only yield on the planet, because China is the only country that had the capacity politically to get this pandemic under control. And I think though the means were very unconventional, I think the merits of the choices that were made, some of them have to be respected, frankly, given the enormity of death and tragedy that we're experiencing and others in like-minded democracies are experiencing right now. It is a catastrophe of centennial dimensions. And so investors recognize that. They recognize that China's system has the ability to deliver a lot of value to investors. And also, many of them also understand that there are risks. But, you miss 100% of the investments you don't try to make, right? And when I look at some of the craziness in the American capital markets right now, China, frankly, doesn't look so disconcerting to me compared to GameStop, for example. But so it's a mixed bag. It's as with everything, a longer conversation, which I would look forward to having by email or however you'd like.
And how would you characterize the interesting last couple of months of delisting and relisting the corporations and the big money players that have dropped in and dropped out?
Yeah, boy. And I mean, the news just today that a general license has been issued that delays the 1237 divestitures until May 27th, I believe. I think what's most disconcerting, right, is that the United States plays a global role as the best, most important capital market on the planet. And yet the manner of regulatory intervention and using our capital markets to try to compel political change in China the way we did over the past 6 months in particular, I think was criminally negligent of the value laden in the American system. We've selected to be a global capital market, not just a capital market for Americans, but one that attracts money and has global rights and responsibilities as a result of the special role that it's played. And the manner in which things were were inserted and then done poorly, such that judges and the judiciary had to put them on hold and pull change things overnight. That's just banana republic kind of behavior, frankly, and it's not befitting of the United States of America. The world is recalibrating whether it thinks that depending on the United States for its capital market needs is so prudent anymore, and that's really quite tragic. I think we have a lot of work to do to regain that credibility and respect now.
I really just wanted you to give me your real opinion. Thank you very much. That was enlightening.
Needs more time. Sorry.
Thanks. Oh, Dr. Deal, you have a comment on that?
Yes, because I think Bob raised Commissioner Borchoff raised a very important question, and I think that it can be answered in two ways. One, with regard to the likely prospects of the investments that are flowing into China in terms of returns that could be generated, and the other, I think, is actually maybe closer to the way that the Chinese Communist Party thinks about it. They discriminate between the real economy and the virtual economy, and financial markets are part of the virtual economy or the fictitious economy. And what happens when huge American pension funds and other major investment houses participate and send money to China is that China then has leverage and influence. And so there's the question of political influence and leverage that's, I think, separate from the value of the returns that people can expect. And I think from a kind of influence or United Front work perspective, it's very consistent with the CCP's goals to have financial elites and influential capital markets actors in the United States have their prospects and fortunes tied up with decisions that ultimately in China will be made by the party, because their system is such that firms don't really get to choose individually what happens to their stocks or to the money that has been invested in them. Ultimately, that's up to the party itself.
Good comment.
Mr. Jennings, Mr. Jennings, anything you want to add from the Australian perspective?
Never underestimate the strength of money power. In my country, there's a huge gap between the way the business community, our universities, our state premiers think about China and the way the security community thinks about China, and closing that gap is something that we've really failed to do. I think Australian business is now starting to recalibrate its thinking around risk of engaging with China, but they've been very slow to the table. I say in part that's because they read the back half of the newspaper rather than the front half of the newspaper. But there is, for example, in our university sector, almost every Australian university derives somewhere between a quarter and a third of its income from Chinese fee-paying students. So we have a sector where the business model is now broken, and universities will go to the wall unless they can achieve the sort of snapback to the old relationship with China. So they can delude themselves into imagining that is an achievable goal. I think a problem for all of us is how do we try to get a conversation going between national security professionals and the business sector and those who are economically enmeshed with China in ways which can produce some sort of shared view about how to move forward. Because it would be wrong for me to suggest to you that Australia is now foursquare behind a single view about how we should deal with that problem. There's a large number of people with deep investment in China that desperately want to return to that world. I just don't think that's going to be possible.
Thank you. Vice Chairman Cleveland, your turn.
I'll go at the end since I was.
Okay. Commissioner Goodwin.
Thank you. I see we have the cat making a cameo here at the end, too.
I've moved him off the desk 3 times. It's not working.
Well, my appreciation to the witnesses for your great testimony. Mr. Rosen, I wanted to start off with you and see if I could maybe generate some discussion where there might be points of disagreement on the panel. You talked a lot about Chinese investment abroad and how the performance of some of those investments have been lacking. And you suggest that the nature of these investments and their performance indicates that it might not be part of some grand plan or representative of the debt trap diplomacy that it's often characterized as, but instead just bad deals. And bad deals that now have those countries reconsidering working with China as an investment and development partner. Mr. Jennings, by contrast, indicated in your written testimony that PRC infrastructure investment and development does pave the way for subsequent Chinese military and intelligence access to these countries. So I want to talk about that apparent conflict within the context of BRI. We heard during hearing last year on Chinese power projections that it could be fair to consider BRI as a strategic initiative, one with strategic goals and objectives and corresponding strategic implications for the United States. Is it that, or are these deals simply representative of the kind of messy bilateral interactions that you get through these piecemeal interactions between China and individual host countries? And as one commentator noted, should we not attribute malice or grand scheming to things that can just be chalked up to bad decision-making and bad deals?
Is that to me, Commissioner?
Sure, to start off.
Okay, so actually, the two things you observe are actually two sides of the same coin, I think. If I'm correct that the commercial outcome of this deal making is not good, right? I am noting that there's very little evidence of debt traps. We're kind of seizing assets, which is what people mean when they say debt trap. But there's very strong evidence of unrecoverable loans being made that have to be renegotiated. And so my concern, looking at things through a development economics lens, is that this is tending to screw up and undermine the healthy formation of good institutions, sound lending practices, that sort of stuff in countries with weak institutions. That's nothing about that outcome is inconsistent with the notion that China knows that it's actually not that great commercial deal making, but there's some strategic utility which impels the action that is, doesn't matter if they're good deals or not. I'll let others speak to the strategic motivation. There is commercial motivation as well. Definitely China's trying to sell product, trying to push overcapacity product out there, trying to find new markets and ways to deepen its economic relationships with countries all over the world. But there, no question that there's often a strategic element to these programs as well. I'll stop there.
Well, just a quick follow-up before we turn it to the other witnesses. I did gather from your testimony that some of these other countries are coming to that same realization, that the commercial aspects of these deals aren't strong. And perhaps, as you suggest now, maybe there are these other strategic implications. What impact will that have on BRI going forward?
Look, I think both the countries, call it 85 or 100 countries, and China itself is starting to understand the long-term implications of this loan book growing as we knew it. China realized it was going to be blamed for the world's biggest debt crisis of the 21st century now, as we saw starting to play out due to COVID, right? That will be laid at its feet because they're the ones that, after all the efforts we've made to try to improve the quality of OECD lending to these countries, China just came in and said, oh, no, don't worry about it. We got $1 billion for you. And that will be they will be held to account for that, I think. And so they realize that every day you see some instance, some case study of a major deal, Philippines, Indonesia, elsewhere, being renegotiated, rethought before it gets started, because these countries are stopping to say, hey, wait a minute, are we really going to be able to use this asset after we build it, for example? So there's plenty of evidence and cases to look at where the countries are thinking twice about obliging themselves to China to the extent that people thought. And there's very good evidence too of China pushing the stop button on its own outbound lending, right? BRI lending has fallen off dramatically, as a number of researchers have more or less correctly described. And that's because Beijing realized, hey, we don't know exactly what we're doing out there around the world, and we're going to get blamed for it too. So there's big changes taking place on both sides of the money flow, I would say.
Thank you. Mr. Jennings or Dr. Deal?
Thank you. So look, I think there is a mix of commercial drivers pushing some Chinese companies, but they understand very well the point about if they can align their activities to Belt and Road, that's going to help the situation domestically. If you look at the South Pacific, it operates on a very different scale to the big Belt and Road infrastructure projects that you might see in Southeast Asia. Nevertheless, it's a very interesting thing. Almost throughout the region, any port that's being constructed, any port that is being refurbished, any airport that is having its runway lengthened or is under management will be being constructed or managed by a Chinese company. And it seems to me that in many cases we see, for example, runways being built that are ostensibly to fly seafood back to Beijing daily, or to support tourism ventures in areas of Melanesia that will never see large numbers of tourists. I think there is clearly a sort of an integration between an attempt to deliver a commercial outcome that is also got dual use value to the PLA thinking long term. The other point I'd make about the Pacific is that in many cases what you see is companies engaging not with central governments but by regional governments, often down to the village level. And we're dealing with people that are frankly not terribly sophisticated when it comes to thinking about China's strategic objectives. All they know is that no one else has turned up to offer investment or development in their province or their village. It is having, China is having enormous success throughout the region. Does this matter to the United States? Well, we're talking about islands that the US had to fight its way through to get to Japan in the Second World War. They are vastly strategic important from how America thinks about its military interests in the West Pacific. So yes, they are important. I'm convinced that behind whatever the commercial facade is of these deals as presented to state governments, regional governments, that there is sort of the long arm of the Chinese military behind them, at least wanting to position themselves for the possibility that that type of facility might offer in coming years.
Thank you.
Can I just second what has been said? And in World War II, obviously, we needed those islands to get to our ally, Australia. The American or Western tendency to sort of think, well, is this military / strategic or is this economic, is a Western liberal tendency. And I think from Beijing's point of view, they go together, wealth and power, as we know from, I hope, from reading about their history and observing their behavior. Of course, if you have the dominant foothold on a smaller country's economy, you will have access to its data flows, access to its strategic geography or real estate, the ability to use it potentially as at least a stopping off point for your forces. If that country stops granting you the right terms or tries to negotiate too hard on economic matters, you will have the ability to threaten it militarily. So just the way that's the more the Chinese neo-mercantilist, if you will, way of looking at it. And we tend to think about it in these kind of arbitrarily or unusually distinct military versus economic terms. And I think that that's a mistake. And I think we need to recognize that the two spheres are not just blended, they're interdependent. They go together in a way where they can't be separated. If China is worried about its economy, it will have the ability to use threats and its military forces to coerce better terms from trade partners, and things will get better economically. If it's worried about its military, it will be able to use its economic engagement to get better technology, dual use systems, access to whatever it needs to buy or extract. So again, these two kind of spheres are codependent.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Commissioner Talent, you're up.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, this has been.
Carolyn, I think Mr. Jennings wanted to say one more thing. He raised his hand. Sorry.
Didn't see. Mr. Jennings?
Thank you. Just in 30 seconds, I wanted to say that Australia has maintained for many years a very sophisticated over-the-horizon radar network looking north and looking west, as you would imagine. In July last year, our government announced that it would construct a new element of that over-the-horizon radar network looking east, out into the South Pacific. Now, this is a big expenditure we're talking about here. We're not doing it because we're looking for fishing boats.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Jennings. All right, Senator Talent.
Well, I'm going to try and be as quick as I can asking the questions. I do want to say this has been about as clear-eyed and powerful a testimony as I've heard on this commission from any panel, and I'm grateful to you all for it and for your kind words about the commission. So, Carolyn, with your permission, I'm gonna ask 3 questions. If we don't have time to get to the third, then I'll maybe pick that up in a second round if we have it, or do one for the record.
Jim, Commissioner Wessel had to drop off the call, so we have a little bit more time.
Okay.
He sends his apologies to everybody.
Yeah, I'll leave that up to you. So the first question, and this is for Mr. Jennings. So how important is America's military presence in the region to its credibility with the allies and with the Chinese? Now, there's been a lot of discussion, not just in the United States, but in all the Western democracies, about freezing or reducing the budgets, their defense budgets, as we come out of the pandemic. What message, if we did that, would that send to allies and to the Chinese in the region? And are there any steps that we could take, the United States could take to strengthen deterrence in the short term, particularly with regard to Taiwan, which you mentioned as a flashpoint? That's question 1. I'll go ahead and ask the other 2 quickly. Mr. Rosen, your analysis was great. So I'm not as economically literate as other people on the commission. But I am a politician, and I put myself in the shoes of the Chinese leaders. So for all the reasons you mentioned, they're not going to, and they can't do a lot of market liberalization. I mean, for other reasons, they just don't want to give up control, right? But they've got to have growth. So this tells me, I mean, just broadly speaking, what I would do in their shoes is I would try to look to step up all the ways they've been getting growth through shady or semi-legal, or in some cases illegal, measures, getting around trade agreements, et cetera. So this would push me to do more of that. Just, I'd like to know whether you agree with that. And then question 3 is, we had a discussion in the last panel about why Beijing did what it did with India. And even though it was so counterproductive in terms of their reputation in the region, and I think Occam's razor would suggest, I'd like to know what you think of this, that they knew they were going to suffer reputational damage, but they were sending the message that reputational damage is not going to keep them from taking the steps which they want to take to achieve their objectives in the region. And that, in fact, in this case, the reputational damage sent the message to everybody that where corruption doesn't work, they'll use coercion. And if we have time, I'd like your evaluation of that. So maybe Mr. Jennings, could you start?
Thanks, Commissioner. Look, the US military presence is invaluable. The last 4 years have really taught us that the United States remains an essential element of Indo-Pacific security. So a strong, consistent military presence is a really significant thing. and we're getting it, actually. I mean, Indo-PACOM, I think, is well focused on this. It's been extremely active in the South China Sea, is there right now with the Theodore Roosevelt doing operations. So those big muscle movements of military engagement, I think, are there. Something the Commission might like to think about is how you advise government on country-to-country relationships. So there are limits, for example, on US engagement with Indonesia on human rights grounds. I tend to think that's an artifact of last century, and what the United States should be thinking about now is the smaller scale engagements with the countries of Southeast Asia and the South Pacific that lend tremendous confidence to how those countries think about the credibility and longevity of America's presence. It also has to be tied very closely to active American diplomatic engagement in the region. And in Southeast Asia, what that means is turning up to the meetings at appropriate senior levels, which can be an impost on travel and has, of course, been difficult in the last 12 months, but really is a core element of being there to demonstrate shared commitment. Look, on the question of Taiwan and sort of short-term deterrence, I think a large part of that is going to have to be addressed by movements of American main fleet units over the next little while. Where I think we have to go, though, is to start to have a conversation amongst the American allies in the region about what are we going to do and say to China about their threatening behaviour that we have seen increasing pretty rapidly in the last 6 to 9 months around Taiwanese airspace. In my written comments, I do suggest that it might be time to think about what is the Commission's position on the debate that I see in American think tanks about the sort of level of overt support that the United States should talk about in terms of Taiwan. And I think we've really failed to bring the allies into that conversation as well. So that's my answer, Commissioner. I think there's got to be both a military and a diplomatic effort here, but the core of America's credibility in the region is driven by presence and sustained presence. And that's really what's desperately needed.
Thank you. Mr. Rosen, yeah.
I'm going to offer one negative and 4 positives in answer. I think on net, Beijing is not thinking it's going to get growth out of global capital inflow to China, despite all the attention on that issue, because they know there's even more Chinese capital that's leaving the country. And coming back to that topic, we just published something with the National Committee 2 days ago. There's $3 trillion of Chinese money in America for $2 trillion of US money in China. So on net, there's more of their money coming out than there is our money going in. They're not going to get any growth out of that, so to speak. 4 things that they do think is going to get their chestnuts out of the fire. Number 1, they truly believe that their investments in high technology and service sector activity are going to continue to be a big source of wind under the wings of their economy, and is going to make up for declining heavy industrial stuff like steel and aluminum. Number 2, the dual circulation strategy, which they announced mid last year, that needs a lot of time to make sense of. Nobody exactly knows what it is yet, trust me, but it does require your attention to see whether and what they think that actually means. It could be import substitution. It could be letting their domestic households off the leash a little bit more and letting them consume more. But they think that that's going to be a big source of growth right now. Third, they do think that they can boost their productivity by implementing some sort of magic market allocation reform that will allow them to make their markets, well, their economy more market driven without losing any political control. And maybe the party committees are the magic sprinkle of pixie dust that's going to permit that. I'm dubious, but they do believe it, that they can get market efficiency without letting go of political control, and that's going to add to their numbers in the out years. Fourth and finally, there's tons of Chinese industrial policies talked about, of course, but one that has not been, I think, crystallized enough is their setup for climate industrial policy. Their carbon targets, they're so far ahead of our political conversation around getting some targets out there that they can use to help impel trillions of dollars of investment into next generation green sunrise activity. Goldman thinks Europe is putting 10 trillion US into green adaptation in the years ahead. That's probably a sound number. China will put at least as much, if not more, into green competitiveness for the future. Whoever can truly have a widely deployable solar source of energy, for example, is going to clean up worldwide as a commercial presence, right? So China is very much organized politically to invest in that. They and the Europeans are ahead of us. We're in trouble if we don't have a radical sort of rewriting our course on that. That will facilitate private sector activity in our economy in the 1 year ahead, I would say. Let me stop there.
Thank you.
Dr. Deal, anything to add?
Just on the capital deployed in the United States, I think it is possible that it could contribute to Chinese growth down the road, or productivity, because it could be helpful in securing useful technology that maybe China will outpace us into putting into applications that then allow them to conquer new markets or dominate markets. So, I think if you think about the money as potentially buying access to technology that could then be harnessed, that's one potential benefit from the outflows. Another is political influence that allows China to kind of keep pushing to the right the day when the rest of the world decides that it's no longer a viable bet, as you were saying, Dan, has to put more and more renminbi behind every new one renminbi of growth. To some extent, China is therefore kind of a bubble. But if it has lots of friends and believers all over the world, then it will continue to get access to capital, and they can push off their reckoning. So I think, from a party perspective, there are potential options for growth or ensuring continued prosperity other than the traditional exclusively economic ones, or just thinking about labor and capital and domestic productivity growth sources. I think they think that they can get advantages from their foreign interactions. And then just on the point that Commissioner Talent made on the interaction with India, I completely agree with your analysis of what happened. And I think it goes back to what Mr. Jennings was saying about the lack of cost imposition on China for its aggression. I don't think we've established a stable deterrence regime. And I think another potential benefit that China derives from its aggression on the border with India is encouraging the Indian Army's dominance within the Indian military, such that resources that might otherwise have gone to the Indian Navy or the maritime sphere are diverted to having to worry about what China's going to do next on the border. And strategically, over the medium to long term, that's probably not great for India, or again for the free and open Indo-Pacific and the alliance of powers that want to keep the Indo-Pacific open.
Thank you.
Interesting observation. Mr. Rosen, did you have something you wanted to add, or something respond?
Oh, I hope the commission programs more time to think about global financial dynamics and how to best serve the American interest, and put these questions of private portfolio investment flows sort of clearly enough in front of members who have to help participate in policy formation, that we can get this right. Because it really is, as Jacqueline's noting, this is really important stuff. This is where a lot of the debate is right now, including within the Defense Department and elsewhere. And yet, most decision makers are operating with pretty thin evidence briefs thus far in terms of what the nature of these financial flows is, whether the government of China is able to put them to strategic purpose or not, things like that. Now's the time to get all that clear. Thank you.
So I'm pleased to be able to tell you that some of those topics are going to come up in our third hearing, which is being put together now, and Commissioner Borokoff is co-chairing that one. Vice Chairman Cleveland, your turn.
So I'm struggling with sort of how to organize everything that we're hearing, and I guess I want to focus it on, because I think growth, economic growth, however we define it, is central to the party's survival, to Xi's survival, and yet what I've heard all day today is that the very things that potentially could contribute to growth are being undermined. And Dr. Deal, I in your testimony and in your comments, you've talked about the anti-corruption campaign leading to idleness of cadres because they're fearful of drawing attention. That the consolidation of power erodes the kind of adaptive innovation that is necessary for either securing or developing the technology that will be critical to growth. That there's, Dan, you talked about the inefficient allocation of capital, the lack of productivity in the labor market. I think somebody talked this morning about there's a lack of incentive to perform because you don't get paid more for more productivity. And that's partly because of the subsidies to state-owned enterprises. So, and then you add to that, I think in your prepared testimony, Dr. Deal, you talked about even repatriated scientific talent is underperforming because they want to stay safe, that there is this fear of the Jack Ma consequences of innovation, or getting too big. And then Roy sort of wraps it all up by saying that in an environment where you have all of these factors that are constraining growth, you also have a lack of information flowing to Xi and the key decision makers that could lead to miscalculation or catastrophic decision making. And so I find myself thinking, if all of those factors are real and they are impediments to growth, I'm not sure where that leads us. I mean, I'm not sure how does the Politburo not recognize that the very things that they're doing are undermining their long-term their long-term interests. Does that make sense? I mean, I'm struggling because we get caught up in this. Yeah, that's sort of where I am. I mean, I see all of the points that say they're on the wrong track, whether it's information or economic decision making, and I don't think she is stupid. So I guess the question becomes, how do they integrate all of this, and yeah, what happens next? Go ahead, Dan.
Well, let me start with this. So Xi Jinping came in 2012. By 2013, he had huge economic tinkering plan on the table that introduced this whole make markets decisive meme that he's still burdened with 8 years later. Right. In subsequent years, they tried to delever the interbank market. It caused a crisis. They had to fall back. They tried to open the capital account. On net, $1 trillion went global, and another $2 trillion was lined up to leave. And they said, whoa, shut the door. They tried to internationalize the renminbi and ended up having to collapse that back and essentially kill the CNH offshore renminbi market in Hong Kong. They tried to delever the banking system in 2017, 2018. It caused GDP growth, if you believe our internal friends, to go to something like zero, right? They tried to introduce independent governors for state-owned enterprises and get the party committee out of making business strategic decisions, and that led to the wrong outcomes. And so they put the party committee back in and even put it into the articles of incorporation everywhere. So to your excellent point, Xi Jinping is not an anti-reformer. He's a failed reformer.
Right.
He's actually tried half a dozen times to do some next generation, next order things to get things more productive and on track. And each time it turned out to be much more complicated than he thought. The instability was greater than he was briefed in by his economic deputies to expect. And they had to fall back on a holding pattern strategy, which is where we are right now. Right. So we have a lot of these campaigns and new things being trotted out that seem a little ponderous to us because, frankly, they're quite ponderous. Last year, they announced this market allocation initiative to make capital, labor, data, even allocated by the market, to which I responded, and I'll ask Yang Jiechi when we are with him at the National Committee the night of February 1st, what were you doing the past 45 years if only now you're saying we're going to allocate all these factors of production via market forces? Like, what have you been doing, right? So I think they actually revealed in the text of what has happened the past 8 years is that they're trying to find a way to address, you're correct, an urgent set of concerns that they have. They're not finding a magic third way to do it. They're certainly not willing to embrace our playbook, because that would be conceding that China should be lining up behind the US and Bretton Woods institutions, and that's not what you do if you're the Communist Party of China right now, right? But what's the alternative? And so they're playing for time. To coming back to a previous question, we're not the ones playing for time, it seems to me. Provided that we don't lose our confidence in our own model and think we need to join them instead of beating them, because we can't do this the liberal way. So we need industrial policy, and we need to step in and decide what the market's going to look like 10 years from now and all this kind of stuff, which makes me terribly worried, actually, about coming back to that question about the American prospect. That's where my fears lie. Not that China gets it right, but that we lose our cool and make some pretty big strategic and systemic mistakes. Sorry to go on long.
No, it's helpful. Dr. Deal?
I mean, I agree. That's why I think this is kind of a high variance situation. On the one hand, they have all these problems, but the ones that were identified and described are there because fundamentally the Chinese Communist Party doesn't want to give up control. And it doesn't want to really liberalize. So it's going to stay in power and come up with workarounds, and their system is just very different from ours. I keep saying that, and it's very centralized, and I think that creates a lot of risk for everybody, but not for the Communist Party. Well, not compared to the alternative for the Chinese Communist Party rulers, who worry that if they weren't in power, they're riding a tiger. If they weren't in power, their corruption, their status would be, they'd be subject to lots of penalties for their position. The rivalries, the bitterness, the way that they think of the rest of the Chinese population. I mean, putting aside the genocide in Xinjiang, they don't believe that the way that they talk about the rest of the Chinese communist population is in kind of, by our terms, not second-class citizen terms. They don't believe that they're like those people. So they're not going to be of those people and let those people determine China's future. They're the ones who are supposed to determine China's future. So I'm worried because just because we can identify these problems or pressures building up within the system, as Dan pointed out at the outset, they're sitting on a $15 trillion economy. They've got 1.4 billion people. The rest of the neighborhood recognizes that, as Mr. Jennings was pointing out, and the rest of the neighborhood worries that we were going to lose our nerve, as Dan was pointing out. And so how is this all going to unfold? I think that there are major risks building up, and we have to be prepared for a wide range of outcomes, and of course not lose our nerve. But that's why my recommendations were to try to propose actions that the U.S. government should take to prepare and try to shape the decision making of the CCP.
Mr. Jennings, anything you want to add?
Well, I can't speak on the economic front, but I was thinking as Dan was going through his very compelling line of economic blunders, that there is a parallel list that one could put forward of strategic mistakes that China has made in its management of key relationships over the last few years. You know, one area, however, where they've had tremendous success, really tremendous success, has been to reduce the capacity of the democracies to develop a shared response to these problems. You know, even today in our local papers, there's stories about New Zealand in just the last few days updating its free trade agreement with China. So here we have a situation where Canberra and Wellington have been unable to talk to each other to find a shared approach to thinking about dealing with China. Australia and New Zealand are two of the closest countries in the world in terms of our sort of shared strategic interests. So how do we improve on that? How do we get a common approach going forward that gives some force to responses to China to try to mitigate their bad behaviour? I think that is a critical task, and one that we're going to have to get so much better at, and something that I think the Commission is in a really nice spot to be able to influence.
Carolyn, can I ask one more question?
Sure, as long as our witnesses are able to stay just a little bit longer so I have time to ask questions. Can you guys spare us another 5 or 10 minutes? Yes, yes. Jackie?
Thank you.
Oh, great. Okay.
So I don't know if you've seen, there was this morning, or at least I got it this morning, there was this, the Atlantic, I think, put out this longer telegram towards a new American-China strategy. And in essence, it said that the United States has to protect its interest in economic and technological superiority and the global status of the dollar and our capacity for military deterrence and consolidating and expanding our alliances. And I want to run through, in order to do that, this telegram, this report suggests that we have to be very, very clear, and this may get at what you just were mentioning, Mr. Jennings, about defining, deterring, and preventing China from crossing red lines. And the red lines that are listed, and I ask whether you agree with these, or should there be additional, should some to be taken off, or are there additional red lines that would be important? The United States should be very clear and unambiguous about prompt, direct U.S. intervention in the event of any nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons action by China or by North Korea. And I'm summarizing these. Any Chinese military attack against Taiwan or its offshore islands, including an economic blockade or cyber attack. Any Chinese attack against Japanese forces in the defense of Japanese sovereignty over the Senkakus and the surrounding areas. Any major Chinese hostile action in the South China Sea to further reclaim and militarize the islands or to prevent freedom of navigation. And any Chinese attack against the sovereign territory or military assets of U.S. treaty allies. Is that a comprehensive list? Is there something missing? To me, there's noticeable lack of any kind of consideration of economic red lines, but I'm not sure I'm prepared to define what they would be. Does that sound like a comprehensive list, Dr. Deal?
Shall I?
No, go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead, Dan.
It sounded good to me. I really like that. And I didn't hear anything on cyber, and I think that's critical. Attacks into cyber attacks into critical infrastructure, I think, is something that we need to develop shared positions around as well. But yes, that list is really important. Top of it for my thinking right now would be Taiwan. I read an article for one of our national newspapers the other day saying, you know, how important is Taiwan to President Biden? Is a paper deal on climate more important to President Biden than the security of Taiwan? Australia, as a democracy of 25 million people, kind of worries about American attitudes to how they'll defend a democracy of 23 million people in Taiwan. So I think that's a critical question and something we really should be engaging, you really should be engaging the allies in a discussion over.
Thank you. And feel free to respond for the record if this was an overwhelming list, but Dr. Deal, Mr. Rosen?
I was just going to say that I think in some ways the harder question is not which red lines to draw, but how to make them credible because of what Mr. Jennings described. I mean, in a sense, we've already had red lines crossed by Beijing with impunity or with minimal costs. And so the interesting question is, what actions can we take with whatever tools the US government and its allies want to bring to bear to make it very clear that we mean those red lines. So I think we could have a longer discussion about that and maybe a whole hearing or two. But I think that's kind of the billion-dollar question or trillion-dollar question.
Economists don't usually work with this red line concept. It just means that like a bad day for the markets is what it means. So I don't know how to make this holistic enough to describe our most important economic concerns. I do think we have some very important ones, but I don't know whether the red lines strategic mindset is going to be, transferable so well to the economic domain, which is really important now that post NSS 17, we have this, this fused mindset around our security. I will observe as a non-security person that there's like 4 different ranks of important things for America in this document, from red lines to major national security concerns to declared areas of strategic competition where we intend to lean in hard with all of our might, and yet it's like number 3 in rank. And responding to genocide is only in group 2. It's not even a red line issue. When I grew up, a genocide was fighting word. And it wasn't something that was, something very serious. It was something that was not tolerable. So I'm not sure, as a non-strategic person, how exactly to understand the pantheon here. But anyway.
Helpful. Thank you.
All
Thank
right.
you, Carolyn.
Thank you. Yeah, I think Robin, also since that article just came out, people haven't even had a chance to
Right.
read it and absorb. Yeah. All right, my turn, and I'm trying to pull a bunch of different things together here. First, Mr. Jennings, I wanted you to know actually that several of us met with the International Trade Committee of the European Parliament earlier this week. So some of those discussions are starting. On Taiwan, I want to mention that for the first time ever, Taiwan's representative to the United States was directly invited to the inauguration instead of having to come as a guest of one of the members of Congress. She actually had a direct invitation from which I think is actually an important step. When I listened to sort of the litany of problems, right, the litany of the things that they've tried on the economic front, I find myself thinking, and yet, right? And yet they had this problem, and yet they continue to rise. And I think in some ways on the strategic front, it's a little bit clearer that when, they're often testing, right? I mean, they're testing to see if the world will respond. If the world doesn't respond strenuously, they move a little bit further, or if the world responds, they move back just a little bit. So I kind of grapple with, yes, they have all of these problems. They seem to be successfully kicking those problems down the road, right? I mean, I don't know that the chickens are going to come home to roost on these economic problems that they have. So I guess that's just more a general observation. I think that they are also reverting back to an old for me, it goes back to the 1990s, but a divide and conquer strategy, right? I mean, that's what the EU-China investment agreement is divide and conquer. And it's, in some ways, Germany's push for that is separating Germany out. I think one of the reasons that some of those things are being more successful is the economic stress that all of our countries are under because of the pandemic. So people are perhaps a little bit more desperate than they were about dealing with investment. But this issue of economic coercion, Jackie, you mentioned, right, that the lesson teaching wars, and I wonder if economic coercion is a substitute for a sort of a more military action, or if it's just another tool in the toolkit. And Mr. Jennings, you guys are now the poster child for economic coercion. So I'd like to hear a little bit more from you, prefacing that with, in September 2019, I think it was 2019, I was actually in Australia for some meetings with your defense community, and at that time there was significant level of concern about the primacy of the economic interests, the business interests in this, and I wondered if the recent economic coercion has shifted that at all. So there's a lot there. I sort of welcome any of you to answer any piece of this.
Let me take a crack at, and yet they continue to rise. In 1978, when China got started, it had immiserated itself down to $350 per capita, much poorer than Botswana, most sub-Saharan African countries in that year. And by horrible, crazy, insane government intervention, making people in the north grow rice and the south grow wheat, like exactly the opposite of what nature called for, right? And so really all they had to do in those early decades was tell the officials to go back to Beijing and stop telling people to shoot themselves in the head. And economic growth was going to really do great things. And that's indeed what happened. There was so much latent potential for growth, for productivity, for China to come back to a less artificially impoverished level. So now we're at $10,000 nationally, about, Taiwan or Korea level welfare in Shanghai, and still very, very poor for 750 million people who still live on like $3 or $4 or $5 a day over most of the, half of the country, right? But the easy stuff is done. It's not just about getting government out of the way now, right? For them to continue turning in these high growth numbers, they have to actually do productive things, some of which are about not Beijing getting out of the way, but getting back in the way. Beijing providing standardized labor rights across the country. That's like the opposite of what Beijing did the past 40 years. Part of the attraction for global firms was that there were no labor rights in China. And so you could go back to doing things the old, steel mills in Pennsylvania in the 1890s way. You make a lot more money as a capitalist there back then relative to your fellow Americans, right? It's because Washington stepped in that, Ayn Rand wrote Atlas Shrugged and talked about all these burdens on capitalism, right? Well, China tore all those out and Beijing got out of the way. But that only gets you so far. And now, truly today, Beijing is in the place where they need to get back into doing the right stuff as a government. It's not what they have been doing in recent years, not just industrial policy. It's actually providing good government for the whole country and for the private sector. The last people that are celebrating Beijing right now is the private sector. It's just not happening. And so we're seeing the proof in the pudding. GDP growth is getting harder and harder for them to squeeze out of this. More and more debt, as I said, is required to get less and less growth. And things are changing. So yes, the and yet is the crucial question, but there's a lot to be said about it that starts to make sense and does condition our strategic outlook. And I'd love to continue the conversation. Thank you.
Great. And I'll make one point, which is sort of thank you for acknowledging the poverty that failed, catastrophically failed Chinese policies had created. So, everybody gives them a lot of credit for pulling all of these people out of poverty. And yes, that's great, but people forget that it was what they did that really put those people into poverty in the first place. So
yeah, we've done the numbers. If China were only as well off as I think Colombia was in 1978, then its average GDP growth rate from then till today would have been about 4%. Not the fabled 10% double-digit number. So step one is immiserate yourself, and step two is stop, and that's how you turn in 4 decades of double-digit growth.
Right.
Thank you.
And step three is take credit for what you've done. Jackie, any comments? Sorry, Kat again.
Sure. Thank you for the very thoughtful questions. As usual, I think yes.
Can I just say something real quick here?
Oops, yes,
Ms.
Jim.
Rosen kind of reminds me of an NBA team that tanks in order to get the better draft choices, loses every game. So they basically tanked for 30 years. I'm sorry, Carolyn.
Jim, do you think? I just want to know if you're thinking of a particular basketball team as you raise that analogy.
The 76ers. They're on top now. I'm getting a little punchy, Madam Chairman.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
All right. So we'll have Jackie, and then we'll have Mr. Jennings finish, and then I have just a closing comment, and Roy might too, and then we will be done. Thank you all for being so generous with your knowledge and your time. Jackie?
So I was just going to say, I think different ways of going on offense or pressing home advantages that China perceives make sense with different targets. With Australia using trade and economics as a lever makes a lot of sense because it not only sends the message to the rest of the world that this is what you get if you are crosswise with Beijing, you're going to be in a world of hurt economically, but it also kind of plays upon the contradiction in Australia's position right now, which is, it's an American ally, but its economic ties with Beijing, are denser or draw it more into China's sphere, and so they are driving the wedge or exacerbating that competition with the pressure that they're putting on Australia. And I guess, as Mr. Jennings was saying, it's not clear that the Allied or the rest of the world has a coherent response, and so that's a problem. They're succeeding in wedge driving or splitting, and again, sending a message to lots of other countries in the process.
Great, Mr. Jennings.
Thank you. Well, look, that's Jacqueline's point. There is exactly what I was going to say. It is interesting that after a year of this fight between Beijing and Canberra, we had the highest volume of trade ever with China. The punitive approach that China is taking is also doing them considerable damage. So, for example, they've ceased to take Australian coal. There's something like 60 vessels, I think, off the Chinese coast, but we now have blackouts in large parts of the Chinese east coast. They will selectively cease to allow in imports of Australian food, thereby punishing top-end Chinese consumers. This is a counterproductive strategy from Beijing's perspective. The other thing it's been enormously helpful for is that it's actually forced Australian business at last into thinking about diversification. So again, I think, China has some political objectives that it's trying to achieve in the short term, doing itself longer term damage. The political objectives they want to achieve is to try to get Australia to shut up, frankly, to behave more like New Zealand. They want us to be less active in the South Pacific and Southeast Asia. They're trying to weaken our alliance relationship with the United States. And they will be able to find sort of affiliates and supporters in my own country, which will enable them to prosecute that narrative. So we have a number of state premiers, for example, who say to Canberra, what are you doing? We want to be able to export our iron ore. So we have a damaging political discussion in Australia. I'll just finish on this point. The Chinese embassy in Canberra a month or so ago released a 14-point grievance plan, which listed all of the sources of unhappiness, you might have seen it, that China has with Australia right now. My own institute was number 10 on the list, so we have some stretch targets to improve our standing the next time around. But really, my point was, if you looked at that list, the things that China was unhappy about would be dealt with in most democratic capitals as presenting precisely the same sets of problems for Canada, for the UK, for the United States. In other words, this wasn't just a bilateral hit on Australia. It was an attempt to set out how China wants the democratic world to engage with it. And their real success in this was in making it a bilateral problem. And our failure was in failing to persuade other countries that they should be supporting us because their interests are fundamentally the same interests as ours. So I get back to this point that the real failure here we can contemplate the successes and potential failures of China, but the real failure here is the part of the democratic West to find a way to push back that we can all share. And I think that surely has to be the task for coming years, is to sort of rebuild those types of engagements. That means it's not just Australia that's fighting China over our 5G decision, but that, every country that's interested in protecting their communications will have a reason to want to do the same thing.
Great. Thanks. Roy, any closing comments from you?
3 quick points. First, Jim, I grew up in Philadelphia, and we call it trusting the process, right? If you intentionally tank, say you accumulate draft picks, and so much so that one of the leading players, Joel Embiid, is now nicknamed the process because he, in his person, emblemizes what that whole several years of agony brought forth. And I wonder if there isn't a little bit of that messaging in what we hear from Beijing sometimes. I'm going to continue to mull that over. Second point is, we started the day wanting to understand the difference between China's reach and China's grasp. And admittedly, as one of the people who helped frame this hearing, I think I may have thought of that in more potentially esoteric ways than or even more academic ways as we consider this centennial year. But the third point is, and Mr. Jennings, we're deeply grateful for your participation, as has often happened in our deep relationship with our allies from Australia. You've introduced a sense of urgency to this discussion about the near-term challenges vis-a-vis Taiwan, which I think are a bracing message for us to consider. It's not just about understanding the difference between the party's aspirations and the cruel realities it faces. There's also real potential things at stake. A deep relationship with a fellow democratic state, American reputation, the ability to coordinate effectively with allies. And so it's imperative on us to communicate these things effectively to the United States Congress in the advisory role that we play. So thank you for all of your participation, and we appreciate you being with us here today and hanging in through the entire time.
Yes. And I actually just want to return some of the compliments, and that is how much we rely on the work that you all do to inform our analysis. I think that just about every time I speak somewhere, I'm either quoting an ASPE product or a Rhodium product, frankly. Jackie, we work with you, and it's great, and thank you for the work that you do. So thank you. I mean, I hope that this hearing has actually given us some themes that we can carry through with our other hearings and our other work. For me, one of the takeaways is still trying to understand better the CCP's accurate or ability to accurately assess risks, because that's also going to inform a lot of things going forward. So thank you all very much. We will probably have some questions. If you are willing to address some questions in writing, we will probably have some to send to you, and we appreciate that. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your knowledge. All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.